Hello students, today I will discuss about the topic dynamic programming. So first thing is, what do you mean by the dynamic programming? So dynamic programming, like greedy method, dynamic programming is also used to solve the optimization problem. So optimization problem means in this problem we find out the optimal solution. Optimal solution means either maximum or the minimum. So dynamic programming is used to solve optimization problem. Okay. So when we will use the dynamic programming, like the divide and conquer, dynamic programming also solve the problem by combining the solution of the sub-problems. But in that case, it solve the sub-problem which are overlapping. So in case of dynamic programming, that is DP, solve overlapping subproblem. Overlapping subproblem means a subproblem which share subproblems. That means when it is called the overlapping subproblem, means a subproblems that is subproblems share sub problems. Okay. So then we can say that is the dynamic programming which is used to solve the overlapping subproblems. But now, so what is the difference between dynamic programming and the divide and conquer? Both are used to solve the subproblems and combine the solution of the subproblem. But the difference is DP solve the overlapping subproblem. So first thing is we need to know what is the difference between DP and divide and conquer. Divide and conquer also solve the subproblems, also break the problem into a subproblems and combine the solution of the subproblem. That we know that divide and conquer use first divide the problem into a subproblem and then it combine the solution of the subproblems. Okay, and here it solve the subproblem recursively. Okay, so, and to find the original problem, it combine their solution to solve the original problem. So that is the divide and conquer. Whereas the dynamic programming, which applies when the problems, subproblems are overlap. That means in case of overlapping subproblem, we apply the dynamic programming. What do you mean by the overlapping subproblems? Where the subproblem share subproblems. Okay, that means in case of Fibonacci series, like that. What is the Fibonacci series? We know that in case of Fibonacci series, we calculate Fn is the addition of previous two terms, that is Fn minus 1 plus f n minus 2. Okay. Again f n minus 1, again it will be divided into a f n minus 2 plus f n minus 3. Okay. So here again we find the same subproblem f n minus 2. So this is the example of a overlapping subproblem. That means the same subproblem, the same subproblem is coming repeatedly. Okay, but in case of, what is the difference between dynamic programming and the divide and conquer? In case of divide and conquer, it repeatedly solves the subproblems. In case of divide and conquer repeatedly, divide and conquer repeatedly solve, repeatedly solving the common subproblems. Okay, whereas a dynamic programming, that is DP, solve each subproblem, each subproblem just once and then store the solution in a table. Okay, so in case of dynamic programming, it solves the subproblem just once and then save the result in a table, or store the solution in a table. Okay, so what is the difference? In case of dynamic programming does more work than necessary. So, sorry, divide and conquer does more work than necessary because it repeatedly solving the common subset problems. Whereas in case of DP, it avoid the work of recomputation because it every time it solve the subset problem for a single time and store the solution in a table for the reuse. Okay, so next time we can reuse the solution. That is the difference between dynamic programming and the divide and conquer. So divide and conquer, it repeatedly solve the subset problem and does more work than necessary, whereas dynamic programming solve each subproblem just for a single time and then store the answer in a table, and it just avoiding the work of recomputation. Okay, so that is the difference between dynamic programming and the divide and conquer. Next one is, what is the difference between greedy and the dynamic programming? Because both are using in case to solve the optimization problem. So in case of greedy, in greedy method, we try to follow predefined procedure to find the optimal solution. Okay, so in greedy method, we try to follow the predefined steps or predefined procedure to find the optimal solution. Optimal solution means either maximum or the minimum. Okay, optimization problem means where we find the solution that is the optimal solution. Optimal means either maximum or the minimum. And in case of DP or the dynamic programming, we tried to find all the possible solution and then pick the or choose the best solution. Okay. So in DP, we try to find all the possible solution and then pick the best solution. So that is the dynamic programming. And in greedy, decision can be taken in single time. In case of greedy, in greedy, decision can be taken single time. Whereas in DP, we take decision in every stages. Okay. And another thing is greedy solve the problem by making the best local choice at each step. Okay. So it find out the local optimal solution. And in DP, it solve the problems by breaking into the overlapping subproblem that we know and store the solution in a table. Okay. And in DP, it tried all the possible solution and then pick the best optimal solution. Okay. So that is the difference between greedy and the dynamic programming. And one of the main characteristics of DP is principle of optimality. That is the one of the important characteristics of the dynamic programming. What is what do you mean by the principle of optimality? That is, the problem can be solved by taking the sequence of decision. So what do you mean by the principle of optimality? Where the problem can be solved by taking sequence of decisions. Okay, so problem can be solved by taking the sequence of decision. And another way we can say the principle of optimality means, okay, the sub-solution of the solution should be optimal. Okay, the sub-solution, we know the solution is the optimal because DP and greedy both are used to use in case of optimization problem. So the solution is optimal and the sub-solution of the solution that should be a optimal. So that is the principle of optimality. So here we discuss about the dynamic programming. So dynamic programming means dynamic programming is used in case of optimization problem to find the optimal solution. Optimal means either maximum or the minimum. Okay. Another one is the DP is used in case of overlapping subproblem. That means the subproblem share the subproblems. Okay. So here the common subproblem can be reused again and again. Okay. So what is the difference between dynamic programming and the divide and conquer? Divide and conquer repeatedly solve the common subproblems. Repeatedly solve. So in case of Fibonacci series, divide and conquer repeatedly solve the same subproblems. That is 8n minus 2. Okay. So it will same subproblem can be generated repeatedly. So this is the overlapping subproblems. This is the example of a overlapping subproblem. In that case, the divide and conquer solve the same common subproblem repeatedly. That means divide and conquer does more work than necessary. Whereas the dynamic programming solve the each subproblem just single time, that is just once, and then store the solution in a table. That is, answer should be stored in a table. So that means it just avoid the work of recomputation. Okay. That's why the dynamic programming is time consuming. Okay. So that is the each and everything discussed about the dynamic programming. And difference between greedy and the DP, because greedy method, here we follow the predefined procedure or predefined steps to find the optimal solution. Where in case of DP, we find all the possible solution and then pick the best solution. That is the difference between greedy and the dynamic programming. And in case of greedy, the decision can be taken single time, whereas in the DP, we take the decision in every stages. Okay. So that is the difference between greedy and the dynamic programming. Okay. Thank you.